Hi students, today we are looking at Is Everyone Really Equal? We will be examining chapter 5, Oppression and Power, and that starts on page 60. This is a really important chapter because it relates to the hiring committee vignette that was read in chapter 4, and it really does an important job of discussing the differences between oppression, prejudice, and discrimination. And the definition for oppression is at the bottom of page 61. To oppress is to hold down, to press, and deny a social group full access and potential in a given society. Oppression describes a set of policies, practices, traditions, norms, definitions, and explanations which function to systematically exploit one social group to the benefit of another social group. So when we speak about oppression, there is usually a dominant group and then a subordinate or minoritized group. And the authors give a very important formula for understanding prejudice versus oppression. And you can see it here at the top of page 62. Right there. And the main difference between them is that oppression includes an aspect of power. And so that is why it is very important to understand who the dominant group is and who is the subordinate group within a situation of oppression. And one thing that they do a really good job to point out in this chapter is that oppression occurs because the system allows it to happen. So after the little formula that I showed you, it reads, oppression involves institutional control, ideological domination, and the imposition of the dominant group's culture on the minoritized group. No individual member of the dominant group has to do anything specific to oppress a member of the minoritized group. The prejudice and discrimination is built into the society as a whole, and it becomes automatic, normalized, and taken for granted. The authors then go on to discuss an example, a historical example, about how women were able to gain the vote. And the only reason women gained the vote was because men who were in the dominant position gave up some of their power to change the laws that prevented women from being able to have a vote. So that is discussed a little bit on page 62 through 63. And so it's a really good example to see how the system itself allows oppression to exist. And even if we don't realize we are actively participating in the system, we sometimes can benefit from the oppression of others. The chapter also has a very important section if you go to page 64 and 65, where it talks about isms. So usually if you hear something with the word ism as its suffix, it's usually dealing with issues of oppression. So the example on the table in 5.1, and you can see it right here, the isms are racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, religious oppression and anti-Semitism, ableism, nationalism, and colonialism. So it gives you some ideas of some oppressive forms of structure within our society, and then they even do a fantastic job of pointing out who is the minoritized or target group that doesn't hold the power in any given situation, and who is the dominant group that is wielding power and almost normalizing the oppression. And so, for instance, with racism, the dominant group would be anyone that is of a white racial looking perspective. So I could even be categorized as a dominant group because I could pass as white. And then the minoritized group would be those people of color who cannot pass as white. And then it goes on with other examples. And I think it's really important to take your time to really understand how isms work. And it's not about blaming somebody as being the one person or the one reason we are in a certain situation as a country or as a nation, but it's about recognizing the structural positionality of oppression and how can we dismantle these structures. And so they do a great discussion here about why you can't have reverse isms either, because you might have heard the term reverse racism or reverse sexism, and that is discussed on page 66. And the reason you can't have the reverse ism is because the power hasn't shifted dynamically between the dominant group and the subordinate group. The difference is that the power relations have been historic, embedded, and pervasive in our laws and in our normalized everyday routines. And so it doesn't work the same way when you're trying to say, oh, well, this man is being reverse sexist, he's experiencing sexism, but it's not the same thing because of that power dynamic never truly shifting. Because for example, if we look at the number of women in positions of power as, say, like CEOs of companies compared to those of men, the number is still extremely small. The chapter ends with, at least in that section about oppression, with a whole bunch of bold subheadings that you should read closely about facts or issues associated with oppression. So oppression is historical. Oppression is ideological. Oppression is institutional. Oppression is cultural. And so all of these bold sections and what is discussed in them explain why it is so difficult to unravel the far reaches of oppression in our society. Because if oppression is, say, ideological, and we don't even realize that it's the dominant idea that we hold about ourselves and about our life, well, then we can't self-reflect to change that. So we have to really understand how oppression embeds itself in society. There's some discussion about intersectionality here, which we will also talk about later in the class. There's some discussion on double consciousness and language as social construction. Finally, I want to point out the difference between internalized dominance versus internalized oppression. And so internalized dominance can manifest itself through daily actions like microaggressions that people might not even be aware that they are doing or committing against another subordinate or minoritized group. And then internalized oppression is sometimes the result of that internalized dominance. So if someone needles at you often enough with these microaggressions, you could start to believe them. And so it's this idea that the dominant group is more qualified. That's why I didn't get a job, or that's why I am where I am. You start to have low expectations about yourself. It's really depressing and complex because the system is designed to create the internalized depression. Other than that, I will point out that the chapter gives you definitions on hegemony, ideology, and power. And hegemony, or sometimes you might hear hegemonic, it refers to the control of the ideology of a society. So when we say a dominant, hegemonic white male society, we are implying that the control is a dominant white male perspective. And then power is discussed at the bottom of page 73. And the chapter ends with the reference again to your writing assignment and the hiring committee from chapter 4. And it asks you to understand the difference between the prejudice that was occurring versus oppression. And in the end, what you should really, really be considering with your training in critical social justice is that you need to be able to untangle the complex ways and the locations that hold together oppression in our society, and that it's not just something as simple as prejudice or discrimination that you might see. It's larger, it's macro. So if you have any questions about that chapter, as always, reach out to me and let me know if there was anything that was unclear. Thank you.